Welcome to In the Envelope, a podcast from Backstage, the #1 resource for actors and talent seekers. I am your host, Jack Smart, awards editor at Backstage, and I'm here to guide you through every aspect of the entertainment industry with the help of some of your favorite stars. These intimate, inspirational conversations with today's most award-worthy film, television, and theater artists provide you, dear listener, advice on how to live the creative life, personal stories of success and failure alike, and maybe, just maybe, a tantalizing glimpse in the envelope.
What it all boils down to is actors who make bold and surprising choices, but they retain authenticity.
Who keeps your attention? Who keeps your focus? Even if they aren't doing the best technical read of the material, do they have something interesting about them?
Okay, testing 1, 2, 3. Who is ready for another wonderful episode of In the Envelope, featuring amazing Emmy-worthy and Emmy-eligible, in this case, talent? Today's guests, the voices you just heard, are Damon Lindelof and Jefferson, co-writers of the hit HBO limited series Watchmen, which was this year's Emmy nominations leading the nominations total. We had Gene Smart not too long ago on the podcast. We've also featured Tim Blake Nelson. The show also stars Regina King, another friend of the podcast. So it was really cool to sit down with two of the kind of brains behind. There were a lot of brains that went into creating such a stunning piece of TV. But Damon is the creator and showrunner, and Cord is also a co-writer. They are both Emmy nominated this year. This was a great conversation in terms of, I kind of think we skewed the difference between a deep dive into the show itself, into Watchmen, but tons of writing advice. What goes into a writer's room? Listen out for what these two consider to be great acting. I love asking about stuff like that. But before we get to that joint interview, it is the two of them. I think that being able to distinguish between their two voices is fairly easy. The audio is kind of different for the two of them. They both sound great. We chatted over Zoom. Anyway, what's going on at Backstage this week? I'm looking at what we have available for the slate, which, in case you do not know and have not been listening to the podcast, is our virtual online community-driven content opportunities for talent and for experts. I'm looking at this week's slate of content. It's so amazing. This week, depending on when you're listening to this, we have YouTube Lives with a life coach and a social media expert. We have Zoom webinars, but we also have an Instagram Live with Samira Wiley. If you go to Backstage's Instagram at BackstageCast right now, you can watch that interview in full. The day that this podcast episode drops, which is Thursday, August 13th, Rachel Brosnahan, the Emmy-winning star of The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, is joining us for a Zoom webinar. If you are stuck at home and looking to get maybe some training, some education, some advice, but also just, frankly, some inspiration, please check out the slate. We, of course, will be linking to that. There's always a schedule that is updated. The other thing we link to every week, I'm going to keep bringing it up because Black Lives, newsflash, still matter. Our resources during the Black Lives Movement article has been updated. I think it's relevant to bring it up anytime, anywhere, but it is relevant to bring up in terms of this episode because for those who haven't seen Watchmen yet, please go watch it. But Watchmen is a sequel to the original graphic novel, but it is also very much a reimagining and kind of a rejiggering of the entire story of Watchmen into the context of American racism and systemic racism, and really analyzing what generational trauma is and inherited trauma and traditions and how systemic it all is. And if that sounds like a heavy drama, that's because it is, but it's also the most bizarre, weird sci-fi show with some of the most bizarre, weird characters. Anyway, Watchmen is great, but I'm going to read from this last bit of our Black Lives Matter article because it is about the casting on Backstage. Remember, listeners, if you do not have a subscription to Backstage, you can get a full free month by using this podcast's promo code, which is envelope. And I'm just going to read this thing about ethnicity and gender in the roles that appear in Backstage casting because it is relevant to anyone who's maybe considering joining Backstage or who is on Backstage and doesn't realize this is true. In order to encourage colorblind and genderblind casting, I'm reading from this article that is linked to in all of our episodes. Productions can optionally tag a specific ethnicity and or gender, or any combination of ethnicities and genders to each role. However, in general, these tags are describing the fictional role/character, not necessarily the talent themselves. Anyone can still apply to any role, regardless of whether or not their profile is an exact match for the role description, and the productions can then evaluate all applicants together and easily cast against type. We also note that casting notices are actively edited for racist and hateful language. I am just mentioning this because I think it's very cool and very, very much a part of Backstage's mission to encourage casting against type and to find the best talent for the job, regardless of physical appearance, ethnicity, gender, however you identify. That is all up and running on Backstage as it has been. We link to this article in every podcast episode, so check it out. And I think that should about do it. I'm very excited for these next couple weeks of episodes featuring Emmy-nominated talent. And for now, let's take a quick break to hear from a sister podcast and then get to this wonderful interview with Cord Jefferson and Damon Lindelof. If you are listening to In the Envelope, you probably love theater. And that means that Playing on Air might be your new favorite podcast. Playing on Air records great short audio plays. In just 15 or 20 minutes, you can hear fully crafted plays written by Tony-winning playwrights, including Lynn Nottage, Doug Wright, David Auburn, performed by world-class actors like Timothée Chalamet, Audra McDonald, and Marisa Tomei. After each piece, host Claudia Catania leads a lively conversation with the artists about the play, their craft, the ups and downs of the theater industry. As I myself wrote in Backstage years ago, the sheer quality of Playing on Air's episodes makes them required listening for working actors and smart audiences. Listen, I still mean it. To tune in, subscribe to Playing on Air wherever you download your podcasts. Damon Lindelof is an Emmy-winning writer and showrunner known as the creator of the hit series Lost and The Leftovers, as well as several sci-fi films and properties. Cord Jefferson is a journalist-turned-screenwriter with Writers Guild of America awards for Succession and The Good Place. Damon and Cord are co-Emmy nominated this year for Outstanding Writing for a Limited Series for HBO's Watchmen, their sequel to and reimagining of the classic graphic novel. Here's our interview with both of them. So we're going to talk about Watchmen. We're going to do a deep dive on Watchmen, but of course, because we're Backstage, I would love to hear about how you both kind of got into the industry. We're all about the early part of the career on this podcast. How did this journey begin for you both? Who would like to go first?
I nominate Cord because his journey is infinitely more interesting than mine is.
I certainly don't think that's true, but I started out as a journalist, actually. I moved from college. I started out as a freelance reporter, and I worked for about 7 or 8 years in different capacities. I did some political reporting. I was a music journalist for a while. I was a blogger for a while. And one day in, I think, February 2014, I got an email from this guy named Mike O'Malley, who is a writer and an actor. And he was opening up a writer's room for the show called Survivor's Remorse, the Stars show. And he had read some of my journalism and reached out to me and asked me if I wanted to come write for that show. And I had only written one spec script before that nobody had seen, that the guy who would eventually become my manager had seen, because he reached out to me. He reached out to me in like 6 months before Mike O'Malley did, and told me he liked some of my journalism and asked if I would be interested in writing for TV. And so we kicked around some sort of ideas that resulted in me writing that script, but I had never written for a TV show before. And I just took the leap and decided that I wanted to give it a go. And To this day, I feel so incredibly grateful for Mike O'Malley just reaching out. I think that, I think that it's a rare thing for people to do. I didn't know how unorthodox it was until I'd been in the industry for a few years, and I realized that sort of doesn't really happen. Nobody really cold calls you to come write for a TV show, right. As somebody who's never done it before. And so I leapt and really enjoyed the process, really enjoyed the show. I enjoyed the collaborative nature of it. I had never, journalism is an incredibly solitary exercise a lot of the time. It's you and an editor, maybe. Sometimes when I was blogging, it was just me and nobody was going over what I was posting. So a lot of the time it was just me sitting alone in my bedroom working on stuff. And so the opportunity to sit in a room and work with other actors, other writers, but not only that, actors and directors and producers and costume designers and, the entire army that goes toward making a TV show, that was addictive to me, and I kept with it.
Is there no going back? It's TV here on out?
There's some, I don't say that. I sort of am interested in all kinds of writing. I still am interested in doing journalism if the time presents itself. I want to write a book. I sort of still want to do a bunch of different things, but for the time being, I'm having a great time doing TV writing, and I feel like, now is one of the greatest times, I think, to be in the industry, because just there's so many opportunities and so many shows. And so,
yes.
I think that for now, my main goal is going to be TV stuff. Yeah.
Very cool. And Damon, this was NYU, and then you moved to LA to become a screenwriter?
That was the ambition. I went to film school with a focus on writing and directing, and the big takeaway upon graduating was that I was not a very good director.
Okay.
And so I was like, all right, well, let's hope that the writing thing pans out. And my attitude was to NYU did a really good job of teaching us the craft and the study of cinema. I understood like what made great movies great, but I didn't understand the industry, the business mechanics that basically that when I came out here, I would be viewed as a commodity. Nobody would see me as an artist. At least that was the viewpoint that I took. And so I think that great art happens in Los Angeles, but people kept using the word industry. And when I hear the word industry, I just think of like factories and big machines and gears and and people in suits and all that. And when I came out here, I wanted to understand that side of it. So I spent around 4 years working alternately as a PA, an agent's assistant, a studio executive's assistant, and then eventually this thing called a creative executive, which feels like the strangest job title ever, because I never thought executives were particularly creative, but Don Draper was. But in any case, all that time I was writing, and really writing a lot of bad stuff, and nothing that I wanted anybody to see. And I was also building a network of friends. And so after about 4.5 or 5 years of this, I finally wrote something that I felt was okay. And I submitted it to a screenwriting competition under a pseudonym for fear that someone would find out that I had done it.
Wow.
And it was the Nichols Fellowship, which is done through the Academy. And it went far enough for me to feel like I'm gonna take a stab at this. So I sent an email to everyone I knew saying, actually, I want to be a television writer. I watch a lot of television. I feel like I'd be good at it. I love collaborating with people. To Cord's point, I don't like the solitary nature of sitting in front of my computer and writing. I would much rather do it in the company of other writers. And I like to talk a lot. So that would probably be a good use of my time. And so my friend Julie Plec, who has gone on to be a very esteemed showrunner herself, at the time was running Kevin Williamson's production company. He had great success with Dawson's Creek, and he was doing this new show called Wasteland on ABC, and they were looking for a writer's assistant. So I quit my executive job to get lunches and coffees and wash cars for the writers on Wasteland. But I was in the room in a real apprenticeship. And when the time came, this is where my story and Cord's story sort of overlaps, and I feel like a lot of successful writers that I know have this moment where some person in a position of influence asks to read you, or reads you, and then that person champions you in some way, shape, or form. And that happened with a couple of the writers on Wasteland, Andy Bichelle and Jim Prater. They were a writing team. They were curious about what I was up to. And I, on the sly, had kind of written a spec episode of the show that we were all working on. And a lot of the writers were quitting the show, and it was getting to the point that they didn't have any episodes to produce. So I was like, I wrote one. It is coal that you can put into the locomotive that will make the locomotive run. I don't know if it is quality coal, but it is coal. And they passed along that script to Kevin Williamson, who read it and he anointed me a writer on the spot. It was like being knighted in the middle of a massive battle. And that was my break. So and then a couple years later, Lost happened, and blah blah blah.
Well, I didn't realize there was so much insecurity early in the career. Is it true for both of you?
Early in the career. What?
Is there a mountain of unpublished work? What is the ratio of stuff you've written that has not seen the light of day to stuff that's out there?
Yeah, I sort of feel the way that Damon does. I think Damon and I are similar in that regard, in that I'm terrified all the time of what people will think of my work. I'm incredibly insecure. Okay. I'm incredibly, I have a huge case of imposter syndrome, and that sort of follows me throughout every job that I have, not just TV writing. It followed me through journalism also. So yeah, I guess you could say that.
It's honestly good.
Yeah, it never goes away. And I would say, between the years 1994 and 1999, everything that I wrote should never be seen. And it would, and it's over 1,000 pages of material, and it should be destroyed. It should be sent to the opposite of the Library of Congress, whatever that place is where things should just be destroyed and stricken from the collective memory of. I should probably after this make sure that I can go through all my old hard drives, for fear that if and when I die, someone will find these things and read them. That's how bad they are.
But those 5 years, but that work is important, right? That was necessary to your evolution.
100%. It's like training for a marathon. You can't just skip to the 26-mile run. You have to do all the training runs. And so I think people very often solicit my advice in terms of what's the one piece of advice you give to young writers. And the thing that I always say is, don't get stuck on the one thing. So many people, they've been writing one piece of material and rewriting, and they give it to their friends and they get notes and then they rewrite it again. And it's 3 years of your life and all you have to show for it is this. It may be better, exponentially better than it was when you started, but just put it away and write the next thing. Don't get stuck. Keep moving forwards. That ultimately, maybe Confederacy of Dunces wouldn't exist had they heeded that advice. I don't know. Some people write one amazing thing. So feel free to ignore my advice, but I just feel I know so many people who they get flattened by the one piece of material. I at least have 18 bad scripts versus one. That's something.
I think that also, something that I find that also does is it allows me to keep from going insane. And what I mean by that is that, there are so many obstacles to getting stuff made in this industry. And there's so many people who need to read a script and give it their go-ahead, and then sort of they give it to their boss, and their boss has to give it the go-ahead, and then on and on and on like that, that, sitting around and waiting for everybody above you to say yes can feel maddening at certain points in time.
Right.
And so in my mind, and sort of over the past several years, the thing that's kept me from losing my mind and going crazy every time that happens is just working on a new thing. And that, coming home every night and saying, like, this is my thing. Nobody can say yes or no to this. I don't need to have any bosses to greenlight this. I can go home and even if that thing is sort of stuck in development hell, I can always go home and sit at my computer and this is my thing again.
So drafting should outweigh editing, I guess. Do more first drafts than revising, at least at first.
I think that's the general idea. I mean, again, no piece of advice. The other piece of advice that I give is solicit advice from as many different people as you possibly can, and then look in the Venn diagram for where it overlaps.
Wonderful.
Don't take any one person's word for it. Cord and I have entirely different backgrounds, not just in that he came out of journalism and I came out of film school, but we were raised in different circumstances by different people, in different parts of the country. And so I do think that there's different paths and different ways to what it is you want to achieve. But in general, the don't get stuck piece of advice, or I think what Cord says is emotionally, there's just the excitement of going into something new. It could potentially backfire if you're always I just always want to go on first dates, because the moment that I get to a third date, that I start to see things in that person that I'm not entirely sure I like. Yeah, of course, that's that's the part that you have to power through too. So,
Gotcha.
Commit to things. But there comes a time when you have to move on to the next thing. And just acknowledge that. When that time is will vary by individual. But if you're been working on the same piece of material for 2 or 3 years, I think that's probably too long.
Yeah. Excellent. That's exactly the kind of advice I think our listeners are searching for. I would also love to ask about influences and inspirations. And I'd love to hear from you both, growing up, maybe earlier in your life, what were the more foundational works of fiction or works of art that inspired you, maybe versus the ones that inspire you today?
I mean, for me, it feels so mainstream, but it's just the case, which is that I was raised in the late 70s, early 1980s. So it was basically the holy trinity of Star Wars and all the Spielberg movies and Stephen King. Those were the foundational sort of things that I was ingesting with a voracious appetite for those things. And when they're, Star Wars movies, you had to wait 3 years between them coming out. Star Wars was 77 and Empire was 80 and Jedi was 83. But then I had Star Wars figures and I would make up stories and then there were Star Wars novelizations. So I was just consuming all that at a rapid clip. Cool. And then, then I started reading Firestarter, I think was the first Stephen King novel that I read. And then I went back and read Salem's Lot and Carrie. And so he would put out about 2 books. It felt like about 2 books a year at that point. So I was reading all that stuff. And then just all the Spielberg films kind of starting, I think maybe E.T. was my first one. And then working backwards and watching Close Encounters and Jaws over and over and over again. But that was the stuff that, it's between ages 7 to 12 were firing on all cylinders for me. And then I read Watchmen. I was into comic books, but I read Watchmen when I was, I think, 12 or 13. And that was the other, foundational work. And I'm not just saying that because we're going to be talking about Watchmen at some point, but it's so much of what I read in those 12 issues, I was I need to figure out how to do that. How can I do that?
You've said it's like your favorite piece of pop culture.
I think I said it's the best piece of pop culture, but I don't know if it's also my favorite, but it's my favorite changes. Favorite is like ice cream flavors. Like I have too many, and so I just get a little bit of each.
Cool. And Cord, what about you?
I've been trying to think about this. I mean, this is always such a hard question for me. So much of my pop culture tastes, I think, stemmed from my dad. I think that my dad was huge into comedy. And so we would always I remember listening to a lot of Bob Newhart vinyl records and Richard Pryor vinyl records, and Tom Lehrer, who's like,
he's a lyricist.
Weird kind of.
He writes those crazy songs.
Yeah, exactly. He writes like crazy comedy songs about like
my dad was into him too.
Periodic table of elements and stuff like that. Like it was, yeah. So I sort of spent a lot of nights on the couch listening to comedy records and George Carlin records with my dad. Spent a lot of time watching The Next Generation with him. He was a huge TNG fan. So I remember watching that with him a lot. But I think that the first thing that I came to that felt really like it was my own thing, that it was not my parents, that I sort of adored and realized this is a thing that is mine because my parents don't like it and I don't really watch it with my brothers, was The Simpsons. I remember sort of being a huge fan of The Simpsons when I was a kid. Like every time that it was on, I parked myself in front of the TV. There was a time in my life when I was much younger that I sort of would estimate that like 40% of my brain was Simpsons quotes. Like it was so important to me. And I thought it was the funniest thing in the world. And to me, some of those early generation Simpsons episodes are some of the greatest TV episodes in my mind. When you had like Conan O'Brien, some of those like old Conan O'Brien episodes are just brilliant.
I just recently rewatched the Michael Jackson one, and it's like, it's next level. Like it holds up. Like, even in sort of a post sort of like everything that we've been through as it relates to Michael Jackson, it's like, it's an incredible piece of storytelling.
Yeah. Those guys were just firing on all cylinders when they first started that show. It's amazing. I mean, of course it has the longevity it does because it was so brilliant. And then I think that another thing that felt like it was my own was rap music. I got really into rap music. I lived in Tucson, Arizona. So there was very few Black people in Tucson. And so my parents did a lot to make sure that I was steeped in Black culture because they were worried that I wasn't getting enough of that when I would go to school. So I remember being like by far the youngest person and one of the only people in the theater for Do the Right Thing when it came out in Tucson. Like, I think I was like 8 years old and my parents took me to see Do the Right Thing in the theater because they sort of thought like, this is an important film by an important Black director and we want to expose you to this. Cool. And so they took me to see that. And so I watched a ton of Spike Lee movies. I was very sort of like New York centric too. I knew that I wanted to live in Brooklyn as soon as I could. So a lot of sort of Wu-Tang Clan, like Biggie, like a lot of sort of New York centric rap music and film I dove into also.
Very cool. Very cool. I can see how these are the puzzle pieces that create the work that we've seen. Do either of you have a writing process? Do you have maybe a writing routine? All that inspiration gets plugged into your ideas and then you sit down to write. I guess first solitary, and then I definitely want to ask about the mechanics of a writer's room and what makes a good writer's room. But do either of you have like a set routine?
I try to start as early as possible. I don't have any other routines. Like I don't have a special breakfast or special clothes or anything. I tend to wake up at around 6:30 every morning. And so as quickly as possible, I like to write. I think that my brain works best from like 7 a.m. to 2 p.m. After that, I start to get a little sluggish and maybe stop. But yeah, that's basically my process, is just sitting down and forcing myself to do it as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I'm pretty much the opposite. I mean, at least in terms of writing, actually, fingers on keyboards, I'm nocturnal. Like I feel like a big part of that is feeling like the day has ended. I've hung out with my family for a bit. The emails are not coming in at a rapid clip. I think when for basically since 2004 now, my role as a writer has also been as a showrunner. And so I've had to separate the writing process from all the other parts of running a show.
Okay.
And so you can't just respond to emails when it works for you. There's a sort of an expectation when you are at the top of the or at the bottom of the funnel. However, at the top of the pyramid or the bottom of the funnel, I think you're both simultaneously. Things will get stuck if you do not give quick and decisive answers. So on Lost, where we were churning out like 25 episodes of that show a year for the first 3 years, the only way to write was to start writing at like 10 p.m. And so so I just got into that habit. I don't even remember when I used to write prior to that, but it's gotten to the point now where, and we will talk about the writer's room process. I think a lot of writing happens in the room, so that by the time I'm actually sitting in front of my computer and writing, that I'm working off of a document that's something to work off of. It's a skeleton, and we're putting the musculature and the joints and the sinew, and eventually the skin and the hair and the clothes on it in the writing process. But the blank anything that I can do to prevent looking at the blank page is a necessary part of my process now. And
Gotcha.
I've been working on like a serialized short story since the shelter in place started, and it's been brutal because I'm looking at a blank page every time. I don't like. I wanted to see what it was like for me to write something outside of collaboration, and I have come to the inevitable revelation that not only am I no good at it, but I don't like it very much. And so that's kind of where I've landed.
Gotcha. So you're craving the collaboration of the TV writer's room.
1,000. It's my favorite. It's my favorite place to be. Although Cord would be like, it is, because you seem like you're miserable all the time. But we had some good times. That was a tough room.
I think we had many good times. Yes. I think the good times far outweigh the bad times.
Completely.
Well, yeah. So I'd love to hear about it. Like, what went into the magic of the Watchmen writer's room, and what would you say is necessary for like an ideal collaborative work environment like that?
Well, those are two very big questions. Yeah. I mean, I think that the Watchmen writer's room worked because for a couple of reasons. The first was that we were able to develop camaraderie as we went, because many of us were strangers to one another when the process started. And I've been in writers' rooms where there were 2 or 3 writers in that room that I had worked with before, but there were 7 writers in that room who I hadn't worked with before. And so that idea of finding yourself in a very intimate situation that requires a lot of trust, because when I say intimate, I think that, to Cord's point earlier about all of us having some degree of imposter syndrome, which sounds like it's some level of false humility. After all, we're professionals, so we're there. So it's sort of like, it's like being a professional basketball player and saying like, I don't know if I'm really good at basketball. I assure you that almost all of us really believe there's a part of us that is like, I don't belong here. I don't deserve to be here. These people are going to figure out that I'm completely and totally winging it. And so when you're in that environment and you acknowledge that most everybody else is feeling that way, and then you have to confidently present ideas and then fight for those ideas, and then employ some level of groupthink, it requires a tremendous amount of trust. And I'll just say that, from the jump, I think that the writer's room that we had together, we trusted one another. And the work was really hard. It was really hard because we all cared very deeply about it. And we all had a sense of ownership from the jump, because we had pre-existing relationships with the source material. But then, like, everybody just glommed on to a certain part of the story that felt like very personal to them. And when you take everything personally, it's very intense, but it actually generates incredible work. And so I think that's one of the reasons that it worked. And then the other part is that I've been talking about this idea of inclusivity, and I'm making air quotes right now, for years and years and years. But I think what I was really talking about prior to Watchmen was some level of kind of like virtue signaling tokenism, which is like saying I have a diverse writer's room that has 8 white people in it and 1 or 2 people of color. That's not real inclusivity. And so the Watchmen writer's room was not that. And particularly given what the source material was and the story that we were trying to tell, that was essential. But it also, I'm spending, 8 to 12 hours a day with a group of individuals who have an entirely different backstory than I do, and finding common ground, particularly through the exploration of this story. Like I've never learned more than I did in the year and a half that we were working on Watchmen. And it's frustrating to admit that you have so much to learn when you're supposedly in charge. But once I got out of my own way, I think that the show started to really do something original and special. And I'm really proud of the work that we did collectively. Cord might have an entirely different perspective. He actually had the benefit of kind of like he was there for the pivotal chunk at the beginning. Then he went off and worked on The Good Place, the final season of The Good Place for a while, and then he came back. And so he might have a better sense of perspective about it all. But I don't know if he'll be honest with me sitting here.
I'd love to hear about your view of the Watchmen writer's room, but also did switching to work on The Good Place and coming back, did that actually influence the second half of your work on Watchmen?
I would say that, firstly, I had just a wonderful time working on Watchmen. I think that I was incredibly intimidated coming into the room because I was such a huge fan of The Leftovers, and not only had Damon created The Leftovers, but also there was a few Leftovers writers in the room, and I sort of worshiped the work that they had done. And so, and I had never been a genre person. I had never really sort of tried writing sci-fi before. I knew that was a huge part of Damon's catalog, but it was not really anything that I had attempted before. So I walked in there thinking that I would be a little bit out of my depth when it came to this kind of storytelling.
I don't want to interrupt. I just want to say that I hired Cord after he'd already done a season of The Good Place. And that is a genre show. Like, it may not be sci-fi, but like they're dead. Yeah. They're dead and they're hanging out and having conversations. Sorry to interrupt, but you're a great job.
No, please. And thank you. But it's certainly something that I didn't come into the room thinking that I was. And so I came in there and was a little bit on my heels, but then I immediately saw that what we were trying to do it was genre, but it was also incredibly grounded and full of rich details that I was super interested in, like generational trauma, like Tulsa 21, all of these things that I was really, really captivated by, along with the genre stuff that people know and love from Damon. So, it was a difficult room. It's been interesting to hear people talk about stories they've heard about the room and how hard it was. And I think that there were some hard days, and it's, part of the reason is that we were dealing with such third rail issues. You're dealing with sexual violence and racial violence and secret identities and things that you hide from your loved ones and anger that you carry with you throughout the course of your life. Like, these are all, and not to mention things like reparations, like all of these issues it's hard to talk about with your closest friends and family, let alone a bunch of your coworkers that you've just met, like that can be hard to do sometimes, but it never felt embittered. It never felt really angry. If anything, it always felt cooperative, and we were doing something that was always moving the ball forward toward a greater good. It was always my feeling that I left with. It never felt like it got ugly or anything. and in a way that I think that a room could get ugly when you're talking about those kinds of things really quickly. It never felt that way to me.
Right.
And so I actually felt bad to leave, to have to go back to The Good Place, because I really was enjoying the work so much. And so we went, but when I went back to The Good Place, I guess it does share some DNA. I hadn't really considered how deeply, but yeah, it does share some DNA. And Mike and Damon are friends, and there was shout outs to The Leftovers in The Good Place that happened, that because Mike is such a fan of The Leftovers. And I never felt like I was too far away from the process of Watchmen as I was gone, because I was constantly getting updates from Damon and the rest of the writers. And when I came back, I was just, I was excited to finish strong. My enthusiasm never flagged being away. I always wanted to come back and help make the best show possible. I was incredibly excited to come back. I was, it was the longest process that I'd ever worked on a TV show, but I never felt like I was wasting my time, not even slightly.
Yeah. And what is it like to end? This is true of the Good Place. I mean, that was the final season of The Good Place too. Like, is it emotional to end Watchmen? I know there was some question about Watchmen coming back, but it will not. Correct?
As far as we're concerned, it's not going to come back. I mean, we are. We don't own. I offered to buy it, and Warner Brothers told me it would cost $7.5 billion.
Oh.
So I can't afford it. So it's their call. Okay. But I think there's a very high probability that there will be more Watchmen before the world ends. Then it depends. What's the horizon for the world ending is really the more imperative question. It's just like, if something is successful, if it's IP that people are familiar with. Yeah. And I also said that when we didn't create Watchmen. We got to come in and kind of do it was an existing record that we were able to put on our turntable and sort of play with and mixing in some different influences. But that record is available for any DJ who wants to spin it. And so I hope that there is more Watchmen, but I think in terms of whether this story that we set out to tell is going to continue, if it does, it won't be authored by us. And to me, I think there's a very compelling argument to be made for that's the way that it has always worked in comic books, which is a writer and an artist. They take a run on a character. Alan Moore, for example, who created Watchmen with Dave Gibbons, he did that with Swamp Thing, and that's how he made his name. Swamp Thing pre-existed Alan Moore, but he came in and did sort of a riff on it, and other incredible comics writers have come in and done the same thing. And, we have Christopher Nolan's Batman. And now we're about to get Matt Reeves' Batman. And so I think that the idea of seeing someone else come in and do Watchmen, hopefully we've opened up the tent a little bit more and said Watchmen is there's actually a lot of room for invention inside this tent. And anybody who wants to come in and tell stories there should be welcome, but we're not going to do it. And so in terms of the emotion of it ending, it was having gone through this experience on a 6-season show and then having gone through this experience on a 3-season show. Like the 1-season show, even though it did go on for quite some time, it just I think that I had the sense that while we were in it, that we all knew that there wasn't going to be any more after this one. Or at the very least, we never had any conversations in the writer's room about let's save that idea for season 2. Gotcha. Or it was sort of we're all together for this period of time to make these episodes. And when we have made them, we will be done. And this story is going to have a beginning, middle, and end. That we all kind of knew that. And so we appreciated every day with that understanding. And then when it was over, because it went on for so long and so many other writers had made other commitments, by sort of the end, it was who's available to come in tomorrow? So we had smaller rooms and with different permutations of groups of people, but I didn't want to prevent any of the writers from taking their next gig because I had held them for so long. And as I said, Cord left. The Watchmen went on for so long that he was able to do an entire season of The Good Place inside the season of Watchmen, and he was there for the bookends. So, it was a year and a half of writing.
That's remarkable. Yeah. And Cord, was there an emotional goodbye to The Good Place?
Yeah, I think that was a show that I think it was a show that just felt very familial by the time that I was done with it, because I had been working with basically the same people for 3 years, and a bunch of them had already worked together on Parks and Rec, so they were close when they first got there, and then they welcomed me in with open arms, and so I really just loved the process of working on the show. I really loved everybody that worked there, but also the show, I think, ended. It was so bittersweet. That show's sleight of hand was the fact that it got you to forget for 4 seasons that these people were dead people.
Yeah.
That just death like enshrouded the entire thing, but you forgot about it the entire time. And so for that last season, those last 2 episodes, you're killing off not one beloved character, you're killing off most of the leads of the show. They're dying. And so, yeah, it was, I remember in the last table reads, everybody was sort of near tears or just openly weeping because of how sad it was. That it was just an incredibly sad sitcom, but that's one of the reasons that I was drawn to it, is because that sort of melancholy nature of it is what made it stand out and interesting to me in the first place.
Totally. Thank you so much, you guys. This is so great. I have to let you go soon, but obviously because we're backstage, we're all about acting. And I would love to hear from both of you. Slight side note, I thought the acting on Watchmen was like maybe some of the best TV acting I've ever seen, ever. And we just spoke with Jean Smart just yesterday.
Awesome.
And we've spoken to Tim, we've spoken to Regina before. But I'm wondering, do you have a definition for what you consider to be great acting? Like what is it that you look for in an ideal actor?
First off, thanks so much for saying that. And I think that, there's not to deflect the compliment, fully appreciated, but I think that the acting on what we're calling television right now, but is actually, I think is more this idea of what's movie, what's a movie or what's TV or what's just content is getting blurrier and blurrier, and you're seeing incredible actors across, different mediums. And so something like When They See Us, for example, that just had, I thought, staggering performances, or Chernobyl, or Unbelievable, just to name a few. And so, fun side note about Jean, and I don't know if you guys brought this up, but she's about to do this project with Mike Schur that just got announced yesterday, which is super exciting. And I think that I've been a fan of Jean Smart since Designing Women, and then obviously saw her on 24, which I was a huge fan of, but more recently on Fargo. And I think that I'm always really interested in actors who are culturally inside a box. And by that, I mean, the culture decides, this person is a sitcom actor. So you look at like someone like Bryan Cranston, and this guy's on Malcolm in the Middle. And those actors have such a broad range and skill. And I find that if you write cool stuff for them that's a little bit outside of the way that they've been perceived, they always rise to it. Now with Regina King, you just put it down on the page and she's going to transcend the material every time. It's not like to have her as number one on the call sheet was truly extraordinary. But with actors like Jean or Tim Blake Nelson, or Jeremy Irons or Yaya, who I was, largely unfamiliar with, except the first time I saw him was in an episode of Handmaid's Tale. And I was just like, there is just something so compelling and interesting about this guy. And I think that what it all boils down to is actors who make bold and surprising choices, but they retain authenticity. Their performance never takes you out. You're just inside it with them. And it's impossible to explain, why some people have it and others don't. And then the other part of it is you want really generous actors who are going to play well with others. And one of the things that I love to do is I watch actors that I'm considering listening in scenes, like when they're not talking, because the really generous ones, you watch them when they're not talking, and that's an incredible performances are happening there in the silence. And so, that's, just at first blush, my feeling about it. But I'm sure Cord is casting his own thing for the first time now, right?
Yeah. But I sort of, Watchmen was the first time I had ever been brought into casting conversations for real. I mean, we talked about it as a big group on Good Place sometimes. Watchmen was the first time in my career that it was Damon and me and the casting directors and some of the other producers, emailing back and forth, where I felt like my input was actually very, very important. And that is yet another time that I was a little terrified because I thought that I was out of my depth. But something that I learned from Damon and sort of following his lead was that idea of trusting when you notice the indescribable, which is that just who keeps your attention, who keeps your focus, who, even if they aren't doing the best technical read of the material, do they have something interesting about them? Do they make an interesting choice somewhere in the read? Even if they forget all the lines, did they do something interesting that you could see that a director could get in there and give them more time, and they could and work with them, and they could be sparkling at it, like that willingness to trust your gut over sort of perfection, and trusting your gut over saying like, oh, this person did a perfect read, but this person was kind of idiosyncratic and weird, and they didn't have a perfect read, but I couldn't stop looking at them even though their read was imperfect. Like, just trusting that and going with that was one of the best lessons that I got.
Wonderful. That was pure Backstage gold. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for joining. This was such a fun thing. Do you have any parting words of wisdom for our podcast listeners, maybe particularly in specific to the age of quarantine?
Well, I don't know. I think now is an incredible time to be alive, and maybe it's just because we're in the midst of it right now. But it does feel like, and I'm not the first person to say this, but like it does feel like a shift is happening. That like whatever direction the world was headed in prior to January of 2020 has now been altered, and we're heading in another direction. It's just one of those events that people will refer to as a before and after. And I don't know how much longer this is going to last, but I do know that this idea, I think that the most emotionally troubling part of it for people is this sort of idea that the light at the end of the tunnel keeps getting moved back. Yeah. And I want to and I just feel like we have to reframe that idea of that there is always light at the end of the tunnel. But like when you emerge into that light, be prepared to emerge into a different world that you went into the tunnel with. And obviously take it one day at a time if you can. I think that projecting out into the future and planning for the future, then it starts to get very devastating when that future changes. We can't really control much beyond what is immediately in front of us right now. And if ever there was a case for living your life in day-tight compartments, now is that time. And when you get very focused on the present, that's like a very kind of corny and meditative and immensely privileged thing to say, because if you're out of work right now, you have to think about the future. Yeah. But the more you can focus on what's right in front of you, I think the better off we are collectively, and just have as much empathy for other human beings as you can.
I would everything that Damon said, and maybe stop looking at Twitter so much if you have Twitter still. That's something that I've forced myself to do, is to just stop reading the doom and gloom as soon as I wake up. I think that this is again, I think that this is an incredibly privileged thing to say, because I think there's a lot of people for whom these are incredibly tumultuous times, and panicking is natural and understandable. But if you can find a way out of that, and if you can find a way to clear your head and meditate, for me, my meditation, I don't really meditate well, but my meditative thing has been doing puzzles, which I haven't done since I was a little kid. So it's like the first time in probably 30 years that I've done a puzzle. But I completed a 1,000-piece puzzle the other day.
Wow.
Just felt,
What is it of?
It was of a Wayne Thibault painting of cakes. I don't know if you know. He's like
of course.
He's like an incredible. Yeah, he's a very apparently famous. It was the only one that they had left at the bookstore, is what it was. That's why I got it. But he's apparently a very famous, non-threatening American artist who just mostly was known for painting cakes and pastries and things. But if you can find something like that to clear your head and turn off your phone for a little bit and stop looking at the computer for a little bit and just step away from it all and take a deep breath, that is, I feel, incredibly valuable in these moments.
I have eaten many cakes since this started, so also helpful. Probably not helpful in the long run, but helpful in the short run.
I, funnily enough, just for the first time ever baked a cake. So I baked an olive oil cake that is incredible, so delicious. There's another. I've also gotten into baking to ease my mind.
Great. I mean, these are great tips.
So bake a cake too. Yeah.
And I hear you on the Twitter. I have not been on Twitter since February, since actually before the crisis. It's been really crucial for me to just...
Very smart.
I can't.
Unplug.
I know, Damon, you haven't been on Twitter since 20-something.
Right. Whenever it was in October the year before the leftovers started. So, and here's the good news is you can be off Twitter and you can still learn what the name of Elon Musk's new child is. It's like all the information that you need to get from Twitter, it will still find its way to you. I am living proof of that. I don't know how to pronounce the name of Elon Musk's child. I think it's like AXAE612 or something like that. But but I still know. So you don't need Twitter for that.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you, guys. This has been really insightful, and I think our listeners are really going to get a lot out of this, especially those who really want to be screenwriters. So thank you.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
In the Envelope is recorded at Lotus Productions and Hyperbolic Audio in New York City, and Soundbox LA, Mark Grouse Studios, and Buzzies in Los Angeles. Thanks as always to our producer extraordinaire, Jamie Muffett, and to the team at Backstage, Samantha Sherlock, Mark Stinson, Caitlin Watkins, and of course, Kasey Howe. Visit Backstage.com, and don't forget, you can subscribe to Backstage by using the code ENVELOPE at checkout for a free trial. That's right, 100% free. For more exclusive content, join us on Facebook and Twitter at In the Envelope, and subscribe, share, and leave a comment. Who would you like us to interview next? Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time for another glimpse in the envelope.